Good morning, everyone. Professor Sal, Professor Alston, Barbara Fontana. Dear speakers, moderators, guests, and participants, welcome to Maison de la Paix, to the 2024 annual conference of the Geneva Human Rights Platform. As always, guided by the leitmotif of connectivity in the human rights field, the theme of this conference is Human Rights Under Pressure, a reason to expand connectivity. To start us into this day, it's my pleasure to give, first of all, the floor to our opening speakers, to Professor Marie-Laure Sal, Director of the Geneva Graduate Institute, and to Barbara Fontana, a counselor at the Swiss Permanent Mission here in Geneva, who is here to replace Jörg Lauber, who unfortunately cannot join us today. So first of all, Marie-Laure, if I can invite you to deliver your opening remarks. You'd like to speak from over there?
I'll speak from there and just explain why, because then I to rush from there. So, dear Professor Alston, dear Felix, dear Barbara, good morning and thank you for having me saying a few words today. Dear colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my great pleasure to say a few words this morning on introducing this conference today, the 2024 annual conference of the Geneva Human Rights Platform, and I'm saying a few words obviously on behalf of the Geneva Graduate Institute. The Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights and the Geneva Human Rights Platform are part of the broad family of the Institute. The Academy, as you know, is a joint center between the University of Geneva and the Institute. Let me start by extending a number of warm thanks. First, I would like to thank Professor Paola Gaeta, Felix Kirschmeier, and all the team of the Academy for the very important work they are doing on a daily basis. I would also like to reaffirm today our deep appreciation of our close collaboration here as elsewhere with the University of Geneva and particularly with its law faculty. Let me thank also Professor Philip Alston, John Norton Pomeroy, Professor of Law at New York University, who will be doing the keynote for today's events, and I heard that the flight and the trip was not that easy, so thank you very much for coming today. Let me express our gratitude to the different colleagues who have accepted to participate in or to moderate the discussions today. And last but not least, let me mention the importance of the support of our cantonal and federal authorities, without which we would not be able to ensure our missions. And this is true for the Academy, but also more generally for the Institute as a whole. The title for today's conference is Human Rights System Under Pressure, a reason to expand connectivity. I don't think I need to spend much time in front of this audience justifying the two component themes of this title. The human rights system is clearly under pressure, along with multilateralism in general, but probably even more intensely. The pressure on multilateralism in general and human rights in particular comes at a time when the need for international collaboration has never been as intensely necessary as humanity is facing a bundle of interconnected challenges that together generate a period of radical uncertainty. And I'm not even here talking about what is this morning probably on the mind of many people in this room, at least it's on my mind, the results of today's elections in the United States, which naturally could increase further the pressure on our multilateral and human rights system. While it's clear that we need more than ever a functioning multilateral system, it is also clear that the one we have inherited from what I like to call the American century is not completely fit for purpose, not completely fit for the world as we know it today and for the kinds of existential challenges that we are currently facing. Amongst the problematic issues of the current system are those of geopolitical representativity, the issues of inclusivity, and also the siloization of international organizations, which implies a disconnection of our work and discussions on different sets of issues. So the need to expand connectivity and work at different nexus points should indeed be one of our key priorities, like obviously you're going to focus on today. This is indeed, in fact, one of the priorities that we've set ourselves at the Institute a few years back when I joined the Institute and we redefined our strategy. While we reaffirmed the transdisciplinary orientation, we also underscored the importance of connecting and integrating systemically the work of our different thematic research centers. This has translated physically into the creation of a shared space and dynamics of joint work between the centers, what we call our Fabrique de la Paix, or FAB, which creates the intellectual and material conditions for joint work and connectivity across themes. So indeed, I find extremely relevant the topic that was chosen for this year's conference of the Geneva Human Rights Platform, and I'm very sorry that I won't be able to stay and listen to the debates and the discussions. I'm convinced, nevertheless, that you'll have a wonderful and very productive day, and I'm wishing you indeed to enjoy this day in spite of the gloomy weather, but I'm sure that the discussions will compensate for that. So have a great day. Thank you very much again. And again, very sorry to miss the rest of the talks that I have to run. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie-Laure. Thank you for those opening remarks. And I would like to invite Barbara Fontana to share her opening remarks with us. You speak from...
Yeah, I have no excuse to leave early. But thank you, everybody, and thank you, Madam Director, Excellencies, dear colleagues. I also see a few friends in the room. Thank you very much for offering Switzerland the opportunity to say a few words at the opening of this 2024 annual conference of the Geneva Human Rights Platform. I'm particularly pleased to see so many present here despite the heavy agenda that International Geneva always holds for us this time of year. Let me first acknowledge that Switzerland values the space that the Geneva Human Rights Platform provides for different stakeholders to debate topical issues as well as challenges to the Geneva-based human rights system. We also value that last year the Geneva Human Rights Platform annual conference took place in New York, which hence also contributed to strengthening the link between New York and Geneva. Today's conference is another perfect illustration of this commitment. The choice of this year's theme for the annual conference, Human Rights Under Pressure, a reason to expand connectivity, is very to the point. We particularly like the honest assessment of the challenges facing the United Nations human rights system, which are many, as well as the failures and shortcomings of the international community as a whole. We welcome even more the clear message that one should not give up. It is not just about preserving what we have, it is also about doubling up in using human rights to guide us in identifying solutions to specific situations and emerging issues, and putting individuals and their rights front and center. Last December in Geneva, the universality of all human rights was reaffirmed during the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We must build on this commitment to the fundamental principle that human rights apply to everyone, everywhere. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights affirms that the rights it contains constitute the common standard to be attained by all peoples and nations. We must also continue to be guided by the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. That is why we deeply regret the attempts by some countries to relativize their human rights obligations or even to use the principle of sovereignty to protect themselves from any critical external scrutiny of their domestic situation. Excellencies, dear colleagues, the double realization that these are turbulent times for human rights and yet that human rights are essential in preventing conflict and finding durable solutions is ground for optimism. We welcome the wide range of issues that this annual conference aims to cover: global health, internet governance, new technologies, environmental issues, and climate change. It is important that digitalization and AI usage align with human rights protection, that human rights and public health are at the center of any global health policy. We also need to learn from COVID-19 that scarcity of resources, including due to pollution, environmental degradation, or climate change, do not translate into armed conflict while undertaking all necessary means to realize right to food, right to safe drinking water, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, amongst others. And also that harnessing digital tools to advance in the implementation, monitoring, and reporting on both human rights obligations and commitments, as well as sustainable development goals. These are all objectives that can only be achieved collectively. We look forward to the discussions within the different workshops, making linkages between different processes throughout the UN system while bringing together experts from different organizations, platforms, stakeholders across Geneva silos is a smart and powerful means to mainstream human rights. I wish you productive discussions. But before closing, let me just underline how honored we are that Switzerland was elected to the Human Rights Council for the period 2025-2027. Promoting and protecting human rights in a strong Human Rights Council and across the UN system is integral to our commitment to an effective and robust multilateral system. We look forward to working towards a world more respectful of human rights for all. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and indeed, congratulations to the election to the Council, and we're very much looking forward to see Switzerland being very active in this Council as of next year, as, well, you've been active all throughout, but of course, being a member also gives additional opportunities and challenges. I would like to thank also at this point, through you and also Ms. Sal, the institutions, actually the Graduate Institute, which as she mentions is one of the parent institutions of the Geneva Academy and thus the Geneva Human Rights Platform, and also our host here in this building, and also Switzerland for your continued support to the Geneva Human Rights Platform and its activities, including this conference. And of course, I would like to also at the outset thank my fabulous team at the Geneva Human Rights Platform for bringing us all here and getting that program together. I'll just also go over there to speak for my opening remarks. Kind of easier that way. And I see the whole room actually. It's great to see a great turnout also for our conference today. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussions of today. Let me add some words on the joys of this year's conference topic, Human Rights Under Pressure, a Reason to Expand Connectivity. It may be wrong to say that the global situation of human rights is worse than ever before in the history of the United Nations. But we can see that the negative news prevail, and that additionally to the non-respect of human rights, the support for the values and legal meaning of human rights are increasingly coming under pressure, including from some states which had in their understanding always been great supporters for human rights and their universality. What today's landscape shows is a stark exposure of double standards by many governments. So what we can say is that the human rights system is currently facing unprecedented pressure. A financial crisis threatens the functionality of the UN human rights bodies with significant implications for the work carried out by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we'll have to see what the election results in a big contributor country to the UN budget will deliver tonight. Additionally, the deteriorating global situation is creating intensifying human rights crises, while political support for human rights continues to wane, leading to a growing perception that the UN human rights system is failing to deliver on its promises. The perceived failure is particularly stark as the world recently commemorated the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights described the UDHR as a map containing the steps that would build societies that would be more fair, more equal, and therefore more resilient. In these turbulent times, the interconnections between human rights and various policy areas are becoming increasingly evident, including global health, internet governance, new technologies, environmental issues, and climate change. It is therefore even more important that within and among the United Nations programs and agencies, human rights are upheld, respected, and protected in a universal, cross-cutting, and mutually reinforcing manner. As human rights intersect with a wide range of policy domains, the 6th annual conference of the Geneva Human Rights Platform will delve into these connections. The conference aims to explore how the strength and potential of human rights can be harnessed to benefit the work of other actors, including those who may not traditionally view human rights protection as their primary mission. We will take inspiration from a keynote by Professor Philip Alston, who has served in the UN human rights system in many capacities and looked at human rights from many angles. then expand on his input in an academic panel, opening with Professor Suri Moon of the Graduate Institute and Jorge Vinuales of the University of Cambridge. Following the debate, which will be co-moderated by Janet Anderson, we will come to the most interactive part of the day, and for that split into working groups. Those working groups, after the coffee break, will discuss how human rights permeate the policy areas in technology, health, conflict, and environment and development. Concrete recommendations from these workshops will inform the discussions in the afternoon closing panel, where high-level representatives of UN agencies are invited to reflect on the place and importance of human rights in their work. We choose to tackle all this in a dense, short day. After all, public conferences have a limited potential for specific outcomes and immediate outcomes, but what we hope is that all the discussions will spark continued engagement, as we saw also from previous annual conferences, including what was mentioned by Barbara, last year's conference held in New York, which have triggered important cooperation and groundbreaking new research projects. And we hope they will contribute to a much-needed strengthening of multilateralism here in international Geneva and beyond, to face and ultimately overcome the challenge of polarization and lack of mutual understanding and empathy, currently growing on national and international levels. Before handing over to the keynote speaker, I would like to thank the partners of this conference, in particular the co-organizers of the workshops. This is the Geneva Graduate Institute, but then also our sister platforms in international Geneva, the Geneva Environmental Network, the Geneva Peacebuilding Platform, the Global Cities Hub, the Geneva Internet Platform, and International Geneva Global Health Platform. And also the other organizers who join us with their input and expertise: Euridocs, the International Commission of Jurists, Earth Justice, the Danish Institute for Human Rights, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, the Pacific Community, UNDP, and of course OHCHR. And with this, may I invite you, Philip, to, I think you're also speaking from here, to set the scene for the day with your keynote. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thanks very much to the Graduate Institute, to the Academy, to the platform, to Felix for having, and his colleagues for having organized this and invited me. I'm a little bit intimidated as I look around the room and see a number of people who actually know a lot more about what's going on these days than I do. But I won't be deterred by inferior knowledge. I think it's true, as both the director and Felix have said, that we are facing very major challenges in the overall human rights system. We do see the effort to reduce financing, to roll back progress that's been made in key areas like women's rights, reproductive rights, LGBT rights, and so on. We see prominent governments standing by while key principles of international humanitarian law are being destroyed on a daily basis, and that will have very significant ongoing consequences for the regime, which we are all hiding from and pretending do not currently exist. But I want to say that we should not be despondent, that the system is much more resilient than we think it is. The system is happily vastly more than what happens here in Geneva, even though that will be the focus, I think, of this conference and also of my remarks. But it is important to acknowledge that over the last 50 years or so, the system, broadly defined, has grown, expanded, matured in ways that were then unimaginable, and that it has succeeded in unleashing and reinforcing a lot of forces on the ground that are vitally struggling for human rights in their own ways, regardless of what happens here in Geneva. And that is an enduring achievement. It is the main hope that we have, that the peoples in so many countries that are undergoing major human rights challenges are in fact resilient, have not given up on their demands for human rights or their aspirations to meet them. And we really have to keep that in mind as we go along. Just a couple of observations about the system, which I think are worth keeping in mind. The first is that one of the great strengths of the UN system that we are looking at today is what might be called its fragmentation, or more accurately, its decentralization and the absence of hierarchy. What we see is that when one or other of the key actors is unable to act meaningfully or effectively for political or other reasons, invariably another one pops up to fill the space. It's something like a game of whack-a-mole, as the Americans call it, on the part of the human rights violators. They can squash one particular actor, at least temporarily, but another one pops up. We are seeing, I mean, a fascinating example today, for example, as the Security Council is completely immobilized, as the Human Rights Council is not doing what it should be doing. Ironically, it's the International Court of Justice, which many of us were pretty, in the human rights area, pretty critical of over many years, which is now stepping up to take the lead on issues in the Middle East. But that's an example of the extent to which, if it's not the High Commissioner, if it's not the General Assembly or the Council, it might be a treaty body, it might be a special rapporteur, but there are actors in the system who can keep it honest, who can speak out, and who cannot be silenced comprehensively. And I think that is an important element in it all. The other development that I'd like to draw attention to, it's fairly obvious in a way, but the growth of the treaty bodies and the functions that they perform, particularly through general comments, and the explosion of the special procedures system since the early 1980s, have actually somewhat unexpectedly created a powerful generator of knowledge in the system. So I don't wish to be critical of OHCHR or any of the other bureaucracies involved, but they will never have the capacity to be at the cutting edge in responding to a lot of new issues. They're not permitted by states to do that, they're not funded to do that, and they don't have the sort of agility and flexibility to do it. But the system of special rapporteurs and of treaty bodies has actually brought in a really diverse array of actors who often are at the cutting edge. And I don't just mean scientifically in terms of being on top of issues like artificial intelligence or other new technologies or whatever it might be, but also in terms of bringing voices from the field, from the ground, and magnifying those at the international level. So regardless of the actual protection function that those bodies might fulfill, they are regenerating, rejuvenating in a sort of constant way the knowledge base on which the system operates. And I think that's another cause for celebration. We do, of course, need to respond to the challenges. They've been outlined in the materials for this conference today, and we're all well aware of them. The one that I want to focus on most, or the response that I want to focus on most, is mentioned in the materials, and that is the talk of getting back to the core human rights, or what I think is referred to as les droits de l'homme réduits. I want to say that that, at least in my view, is precisely and absolutely the wrong strategy. In fact, my argument is the opposite. My argument is that we are where we are today largely because we have, and I say we, and I've been part of that, made a very big effort to narrow down the focus of the overall system. Many will not wish to acknowledge this, but I would still persist in arguing that economic, social, and cultural rights remain largely neglected by the system. When you, of course, there are a few idiots around like me who talk about these issues, but basically, if you're having a serious conversation about human rights, it's about civil and political rights. And as I'll say in a minute, it's not just about civil and political rights, it's about particularly atrocious violations of those rights. So we start from this broad notion of human rights, including all of the different rights and trying to capture as many of the aspirations and hopes of humankind. We eliminate economic, social, and cultural rights because they are opposed by Western countries primarily, led by the United States, but acquiesced in by many other Western governments, which do very little when it comes to economic and social rights. And we then say, okay, we're left with civil and political rights, but these are the real rights. That's what really counts, and if we enjoy those, then the rest will be able to take care of themselves. And what I want to argue is that in that area, we are becoming increasingly narrow in our focus. I've written about this under the perhaps strange title of the criminalization of human rights, describing what I see as a process of becoming more and more focused upon atrocities. Atrocities are where the action is. And what we need to do with atrocities is find the perpetrators and prosecute them. And this will be a huge achievement for the system. And what I want to argue is that, of course, I'm all in favor of prosecuting perpetrators. I'm all in favor of that form of accountability. But to the extent that the system focuses primarily on those issues, and I would argue that it is moving in that direction, we are really going in the wrong way. If you look at the major challenges in the world, I guess I would, in a very simplistic way, identify two. And that is, first of all, radically growing inequality, linked to the feeling, and this, I think, is what the United States election is all about, the feeling on the part of the average person that the system doesn't work for them anymore. And of course, they're dead right. It's not working for them anymore. The growth in inequality has been very deliberate, has been brought about by a range of economic strategies precisely designed to do that, to accumulate immense wealth in very few hands, and along with that wealth goes political power, and along with the wealth and the political power go an increasing emphasis not on anything like the economic and social rights of the average person, but instead on the further empowerment of those elites. But the human rights regime has very little to say to those people, very little to offer to them. The theoreticians can say, but you have an economic right. My friend, you have a right to health. Well, in the United States, where the hell is my right to health care? The right to health care is a joke. I speak to my daughters who live in Australia, and each time I speak to them, I get a lesson in what I, as an American, have come to think of as socialism. My daughter will say, but Dad, of course, this person that I've been talking about will have, many months of paid parental leave. And I'll say something like, something elderly and sexist and American like, but surely the husband doesn't get that. And the answer is, no, of course, that's part of it. And the my daughters are quite old now, but still their friends are having babies. Having a baby is not a potential catastrophe as it is in the United States and, of course, in so many other countries. It's all paid for. It's covered. There's a governmental system which says that everyone should be able to live without living under a shadow of economic oppression. And make no mistake, Australia is basically a neoliberal country. But by comparison with many others, of course, it does nonetheless take economic and social rights seriously. But the system of which we are a part does very little to contribute to that. And I think that means that we are of ever less relevance to what the average person around the world feels as their real need. The increasing lack of access to education, lack of access to almost any public services, as I'll mention in a moment, lack of access to healthcare and so on. The other element that I've already mentioned, I won't go into it in great detail. For me, it was epitomized in some ways by the mandate given to the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, which was very heavily weighted in favor of international criminal responsibility. And I can tell you that if you think that the prosecution of Vladimir Putin and one or two other people is going to resolve the problems in Ukraine, or is going to really shed light on the broad array of human rights challenges that exist there, I think you're living in an unreal universe. But that's what we are tending to do. We are putting large amounts of money into these various international monitoring mechanisms that are collecting millions of items of evidence, tens of millions of items of evidence, on the basis that one day prosecutions will take place. First of all, there's a very good chance that prosecutions won't take place in a lot of those countries. If there's a resolution of the terrible crises, the last thing that a new government is going to do is to say, now we have to prosecute a handful of our enemies. Secondly, if the prosecutions do take place, it will be a handful. And in the meantime, the factors that gave rise to the conflict are not seen by human rights actors as really central. Instead, they are busily doing forensics. That's really going to help address the root causes. So this move towards a focus on the criminal, which of course is almost transforming the international human rights regime into part of the international criminal law system, I think needs to be kept very closely under scrutiny. I'm, of course, happy to talk more about those issues later on. I can't do justice to it now, but I want to go on and mention 3 other issues before I close. And these are, you might think these are barely connected, but I think they all are. The first, which will come as a surprise, no doubt, and it's partly I'm just an academic and I happen to be working on this issue right now, but I'm working on it because I think it is absolutely central and being ignored. And it goes under the heading of privatization. Now, privatization, I think we know, is a ubiquitous phenomenon, but it's not your father's or grandfather's privatization. It's not what Pinochet did, it's not what Thatcher did. It has a new name. We call it public-private partnerships. What we're doing in that context is, well, let me first of all give some examples. If any of you are involved with the Sustainable Development Goals, if any of you are involved with the fight against global warming, or efforts to bring universal health care or to improve access to education, you will have been told, particularly by the UN Secretary General, who deserves a medal, that the only way forward is through the private sector. We simply cannot afford these things, my friends. And if we don't, quote, partner with the private sector, none of these things can be achieved. So the overwhelming emphasis now is let's go with the private sector. Is that a problem? Well, for me, it is a major problem. The consequences of privatization are, of course, to withdraw the government from the field. It withdraws governmental accountability. It withdraws the capacity of governments to respond to the demands of the people. You want more healthcare, you want better education, you want better roads, you want whatever. Sorry, we don't do that anymore. That's the Alston Corporation. And if you think that Alston's going to pick up a telephone or respond to an email, you must be crazy, because he's out there counting the profits. Privatization and the role of the private sector is simply premised on the fact that the private sector is going to make large profits. Those profits, in some cases, are often, in fact, in double digits. So where do the double digits come from? Where is it that suddenly governments couldn't afford to provide these services, but they're now being provided by the private sector, which can also make a profit of 10, 15, 20%? And the answer, of course, is that what privatization is all about, by definition, is cutting costs, often reducing the quality, at least at the lower end, increasing the charges, and invariably relying heavily upon government subsidies. The term, which is sort of obscene, of de-risking. The notion that governments must take the risks, because we in the private sector can't be expected to take risks. We're not going to invest if it's a risky proposition. So the government will take care of the risks, and the private sector will take care of making the profits. That's the system that we're moving to almost across the board in almost all countries. Now, it's reasonable for this audience to say, okay, but what's that got to do with human rights? Well, the answer is that the human rights community, broadly defined, is doing pretty much nothing about this process. What it's doing, there have been a number of very good reports by various rapporteurs and others. Treaty bodies have said we need to keep a close eye on this and we need to make sure that governments don't lose the capacity to blah, blah, blah. None of this is having any impact. And given the lack of progress on the business and human rights front, and I admit to being perhaps more negative than most on the possibilities that business and human rights will really end with any serious accountability for corporations, the result is that an increasing percentage of the overall sort of public sphere, as we might like to think of it, is simply removed from the scope of human rights, from the meaningful and effective scope of human rights. So I think we very much need to rethink the way in which we are handling this issue. It's complex. Most of us in the field won't want to do it. I mean, I don't know anything about business. I don't know how we can, make some of these technical inputs and so on. That's not what I do. I'm a prosecutor. I want to get a violator and I want to get them into prison. Well, you're not going to help us in the most important causes unless you are getting involved in these more sophisticated ways of looking at forms of regulation at the national level in particular. I'll give you a quick example. Some of you will know this, others won't. Thames Water. One of the outcomes of Margaret Thatcher's privatisation efforts in the United Kingdom. Thames Water privatised, much of it coming, from an Australian bank, Macquarie Bank, huge investments. What's happened in the last 30, 40 years has been a massive outflow of profits distributed to shareholders, tens of billions of pounds. The system happens, to be breaking down almost irretrievably because, of course, the private actors haven't been putting money back into rebuilding the system to responding to problems. They've been watching it gradually deteriorate while paying ever more money to the directors and to the shareholders. And the new UK government is grappling with an impossible dilemma involving tens of billions of pounds thanks to privatisation. And if you look at the literature on privatisation, you will see remarkably little literature that actually is able to defend most exercises in privatisation. But that doesn't stop the fact that we're moving rapidly down that road and that human rights actors are not doing anything much about it. Second last issue, and you might think that I'm living in the past, is climate change. Do you remember climate change? You probably don't. 5 years ago, we were really conscious of climate change. We were really worried about it. And there have been some good things in the intervening 5 years. We've got a special rapporteur on climate change. We've got a new right to a healthy environment. We've got some fascinating strategic litigation against oil companies and various others. But climate change is simply accelerating. The major fossil fuel producers have backed off on a lot of the measures that they announced 5 years ago. Governments are getting nowhere at the COPs. And in the human rights field, my sense is that it's no longer a key issue. It's a checklist issue, but we're not treating it as the existential threat that it is. 10 years, 20 years from now, this world ain't going to be what it is today. We can think right now, well, Bangladesh, Pakistan, maybe Valencia, but it's not going to happen to us. I'm afraid it is, and I'm afraid that the world that we're giving to our children is already hugely diminished, and within 10 years, within 20 years, will be a totally different world. Every single human right is being impacted by this. And yet, most of us, I think, in the field basically want to say, yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that there's a couple of environmental NGOs that are tackling this, and it's really important. But, you know, in my field, which is gender or disability or race or whatever it might be, or social rights, you know, there are equally pressing demands, and that's where I've got to focus. Well, all I can say to you is that your field is going to be flooded and burned by climate change. And the people that you think whose interests you think you're protecting are going to be radically affected by climate change. So the question is what we can do. I would like to think, this is not as a matter of international law, but more pragmatically, that we should identify climate change as a sui generis issue. In other words, in a class of its own, not like any other. It is the ultimate cross-cutting issue that is going to affect everything. You know, whether you're into human rights defenders, whether you're into the right to free speech, the right to protest, let alone any of the economic and social rights, all of those are going to be inundated as a result of climate change and the massive migration that is unavoidable with climate change. And so I think what we need is to see ourselves as part of a system and to be asking what our group is doing or could do to reinforce action in the area of climate change. I personally don't think it is valid to say, I don't understand climate change and I don't do it, because I'd be very happy to talk to you. Tell me what your rights issue is, and I'll tell you the ways in which climate change is going to completely upend that, probably within a decade. And so for us to be sitting back and not doing anything is pretty foolish. Final issue is that of connectivity, which is a key focus of the conference. And I just want to say that I think we've done much worse in connectivity than we often think we have. I would say there are two broad dimensions that I would look at. First is simply the connectivity among civil society organizations, where human rights actors have not been particularly good at reaching out and working with groups that have different agendas on the ground. And the result of that is very problematic, because human rights actors, particularly given what I described at the beginning of this ever-growing narrowing of focus of what they really want to do, human rights actors don't have all that many natural allies. They need to be working with groups working on environment, working on gender, working on social issues and so on, to a much greater extent than they currently are. And although this has often been recognized, I don't think we're seeing the sort of progress in practice that we should. The final dimension, because it's on the agenda of this conference and will take up quite a lot of time, is that of international organizations and human rights. What was once called mainstreaming, but is not, I see, on this agenda. And there, I think it's related to the phenomena that I described earlier. The human rights community has, in my view, done very little to actually try to convince people working in other areas that human rights can be helpful or constructive. Human rights actors have tended to see this as a one-way street. use stupid UN organization, whatever it is, whether it's UNDP, UNEP, ITO, WHO, whatever. You should be doing more human rights. But the challenge, of course, is to work out what that actually means. And very often, what the human rights actors have in mind is that you should be cutting off assistance to them or them or them. You should not be working with that individual or whatever. And of course, it's the perfect losing proposition, because if you think agencies working in the field are going to be inspired to simply cut off, I'm not saying that there won't be circumstances that are so grim, as in the human rights up front investigation that followed the debacle in Sri Lanka and so on, that there should not be some negative dimensions, but the principal focus of connectivity has to be to identify the positive ways in which the organizations working in other fields can make use of human rights. Whether it's gender, whether it's disability, whether it's race, whatever it is, how can those issues be more constructively brought into your project, your program area? Not how can you punish, how can you cut off, how can you shed the spotlight on violators and so on. We have to get beyond that mentality. But as I said, to bring it full circle, to the extent that we are marginalizing economic, social and cultural rights, and then narrowing down our own focus on civil and political rights to become preoccupied with identifying violators, it's not very conducive to reaching out to these international agencies and saying there's a lot in what we are doing that could be relevant to and used by you. Sorry to have covered so much ground, but thank you for listening.